The morning frost clung to the cobblestones of Villers Bocage like a shroud. Each breath of the German panzer crew visible in the crisp Norman air of June 11th, 1944. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann adjusted his black leather gloves inside the commander's cupola of his Tiger I. The massive 88mm gun casting its shadow across the medieval town square. The acrid smell of diesel fuel mixed with the sweet scent of blooming apple orchards beyond the village, creating an almost peaceful contradiction to the war that had brought him here. In the distance, the rhythmic rumble of approaching engines grew steadily louder, accompanied by the distinctive clatter of steel tracks on stone, a sound that had become as familiar to German ears as their own heartbeat. Wittmann had heard the stories from his fellow panzer commanders over schnapps and cigarettes in the weeks following D-Day. American Sherman tanks, they said with barely concealed amusement, were nothing more than mobile coffins, thin-skinned death traps that burned so readily that Allied crews had nicknamed them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter slogan, "Lights up the first time, every time." The German tank crews had developed their own crude terminology for these encounters. Tommy cooking, they called it, watching the orange flames and black smoke billow from knocked-out Shermans across the Bocage countryside. The mathematical certainty seemed overwhelming. A Tiger I's 88mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at distances exceeding 2,000 meters, while the American tank's 75mm gun required closing to within 500 meters to have any hope of penetrating the Tiger's thick steel hide. This morning, in Villers Bocage, represented everything the German armored forces believed about their superiority over American industrial mass production. The Wehrmacht had built their doctrine around individual excellence, superior training, superior equipment, superior tactical knowledge passed down through generations of Prussian military tradition. Each Tiger tank represented months of precision engineering, crafted by skilled workers in factories that prioritized quality over quantity. The crews themselves were veterans of campaigns across Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, men who had learned their deadly trade in the crucible of actual combat rather than train. It was conceived as something far more revolutionary and ultimately more terrifying. A weapon of democratic abundance, a mechanical manifestation of American industrial capacity that could overwhelm any enemy through sheer numbers, reliability, and logistical supremacy. The story of this transformation began not in the Norman hedgerows but in the factories of Detroit, where automotive assembly lines that had once produced Buicks and Chevrolets now churned out M4 Sherman tanks with the same ruthless efficiency that had revolutionized civilian transportation. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone could produce a complete Sherman every hour during peak production, while German factories struggled to complete one Tiger tank per week. This was not merely a difference in manufacturing capability. It represented entirely different philosophies of warfare itself. General George S. Patton had understood this distinction earlier than most of his contemporaries. "I don't want to get any messages saying, 'I am holding my position,'" he had told his officers before the Normandy invasion. "We are not holding a goddamned thing. Let the Germans do that. We are advancing constantly." The Sherman tank embodied this aggressive, forward-thinking doctrine. It was designed not to engage in static defensive battles, but to exploit breakthroughs, to maintain momentum, to keep moving forward regardless of obstacles or opposition. The first indication that German assumptions might be flawed had come during the early fighting in the Bocage country immediately following D-Day. Individual Sherman tanks might indeed fall victim to concealed German anti-tank guns, or the dreaded Tigers and Panthers. But for every Sherman destroyed, 3 more appeared to take its place. American tank crews, initially green and inexperienced, began developing tactics that played to their equipment's strengths, rather than fighting on German terms. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division exemplified this evolution in American tank warfare. His Sherman, nicknamed In the Mood, had survived 12 major engagements by June 1944, not through superior armor protection, but through superior mobility, crew coordination, and aggressive tactics that kept German defenders constant.
Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division Reconnaissance Battalion, noted in his memoirs how the character of American attacks had changed dramatically from the cautious probing movements of early June to the bold coordinated assaults of late summer. "They no longer seemed afraid of our tanks," he wrote. "They moved with a confidence that was unnerving to witness." This confidence stemmed from several factors that German intelligence had failed to properly assess. The Sherman's mechanical reliability meant that American armored units could maintain higher operational readiness rates than their German counterparts, whose sophisticated engineering often translated into frequent breakdowns and lengthy repair periods. A Tiger tank might possess superior firepower and protection, but if it spent half its time in maintenance, its tactical value diminished considerably. More importantly, American tank crews were beginning to exploit their numerical superiority through coordinated tactics that overwhelmed German defensive positions through multiple simultaneous threats. The standard German anti-tank defense relied on concealed positions that could engage Allied armor at maximum range. But this strategy proved increasingly ineffective when faced with multiple Shermans approaching from different directions, supported by artillery and close air support that German forces could no longer provide in sufficient quantities. The sound that had awakened Villers Bocage that morning in June represented something more than approaching enemy tanks. It was the rumble of American industrial democracy made manifest in steel and gasoline. Each Sherman carried within its mechanical systems the accumulated knowledge of Detroit assembly workers, Kansas wheat farmers turned tank drivers, and Texas oil riggers turned mechanics. This was warfare not as an aristocratic art form practiced by professional military castes, but as the collective expression of an entire society mobilized for victory. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose 37th Tank Battalion would later spearhead Patton's relief of Bastogne, had articulated this philosophical difference during a briefing to his officers in July 1944. "The Germans fight like craftsmen," he explained. "Each engagement is a work of art, precisely planned and expertly executed." When the Sherman tank was knocked out, American recovery teams would appear within hours to either repair the damage or salvage useful components for other vehicles. The mechanical standardization that German engineers had dismissed as inferior craftsmanship actually enabled this rapid maintenance and replacement cycle. A damaged transmission from one Sherman could be installed in another within a few hours, while a broken Tiger transmission might require weeks of specialized repair work or complete vehicle replacement. The symbolic power of this difference became apparent in the aftermath of each engagement. German tank crews, accustomed to fighting with equipment they understood intimately and could not easily replace, developed an increasingly cautious mindset as the campaign progressed. Each engagement carried the weight of irreplaceable losses, not just in human terms, but in terms of strategic resources that could not be quickly replenished. American crews, by contrast, fought with the psychological security of knowing that their individual tank was one small part of an inexhaustible stream of similar vehicles flowing from factories back home. This knowledge fostered an aggressive, forward-thinking tactical approach that German defenders found increasingly difficult to counter. The Sherman might not win individual duels against German heavy tanks, But it did not need to. It won through persistence, through overwhelming numerical superiority, and through the simple but devastating strategy of never giving the enemy time to rest or regroup. The transformation in German perceptions became most apparent during the fighting around Saint-Vith in December 1944, during what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces, temporarily resurgent with their last major offensive operation, initially achieved significant tactical successes against surprised American units. The familiar pattern seemed to be reasserting itself. Superior German equipment and training overcoming American numerical advantages through tactical surprise and concentrated force. But the German advance stalled, not because of heroic defensive stands or tactical brilliance, but because of something more mundane and ultimately more decisive: logistics. American supply lines, disrupted but not broken, continued delivering fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment to embattled units. German forces, operating at the extreme limit of their logistical capacity, began running
General Major Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, later reflected on this crucial difference in his post-war memoirs. "We could destroy their tanks," he wrote, "but we could not destroy their capacity to produce more tanks. For every Sherman we knocked out, 2 more appeared the next day. It was like fighting against the American economy itself." This realization struck individual German tank crews with particular force during the final stages of the Ardennes fighting. Panzer Commander Ernst Bachmann, whose Panther tank had achieved considerable success during the early stages of the offensive, described his growing sense of futility as American counterattacks intensified in January 1945. "We could hear them coming," he recalled years later. "Not just the engines, but the sound of their production, the rhythmic mechanical precision that spoke of unlimited resources, unlimited determination. The sound that had once represented German technological superiority, the deep rumble of powerful engines driving massive, sophisticated machines, had been replaced by something far more ominous: the steady, relentless clatter of mass-produced Sherman tanks advancing in disciplined formations, supported by equally mass-produced artillery, aircraft, and infantry. This was not the warfare of individual heroes and technological marvels, but the warfare of democratic societies mobilized for total victory. By early 1945, the psychological transformation was complete. German tank crews who had once mocked the Sherman's thin armor and modest gun now spoke of it with grudging respect and growing fear. Not because individual Shermans had become more dangerous, but because they represented something that German military tradition could not comprehend or counter: the mechanical expression of a society that could simultaneously produce tanks and Liberty ships, fighter aircraft and consumer goods, military equipment and civilian prosperity. The final symbolic moment came during the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. German defenders, reduced to hastily trained teenagers and elderly men, watched from their concrete bunkers as seemingly endless columns of Sherman tanks rolled across newly constructed. McKinney, commanding a Sherman tank in the 4th Armored Division during the Rhine crossing, later described the almost surreal quality of that advance. "You could see it in the German faces," he recalled. "They weren't looking at us like soldiers anymore. They were looking at us like we were some kind of natural disaster, unstoppable, inevitable." The laughter that had echoed through German tank parks in 1943 and early 1944, the casual dismissal of American quantity over quality philosophy, had been replaced by grim recognition of a fundamental truth about industrial warfare:
Superior individual performance could not overcome sustained mass production. Tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic resource limitations. Cultural military traditions, however venerable and effective in previous conflicts, could not compete against the mechanical efficiency of democratic capitalism mobilized for war. The Sherman tank rolling through German towns in the spring of 1945 represented more than military conquest. It embodied the triumph of American industrial democracy over European military aristocracy. Each town that fell, each defensive position that collapsed, each Wehrmacht unit that surrendered, did so not primarily because of superior American tactical skill or individual heroism, but because of superior American organizational capacity and industrial output. The sound of those tracks on cobblestone streets carried within it the echo of Detroit assembly lines, the hum of Kansas wheat harvests, the roar of Texas oil derricks, the accumulated productive capacity of an entire continent mobilized for victory. German soldiers, trained to think of warfare in terms of individual skill and technological sophistication, found themselves overwhelmed by an entirely different approach to military power, the systematic application of democratic industrial might. In the quiet moments after surrender, when the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared from burning German cities, the true magnitude of this transformation became apparent. The Sherman tank, dismissed by German experts as inferior American engineering, had become the instrument through which American industrial democracy proved its superiority over fascist militarism, not through superior individual performance, but through superior collective.
America had not tried to out-engineer German technology. It had simply outproduced it. The Sherman tank, in all its mechanical simplicity and tactical modesty, had become the steel embodiment of a philosophical truth that German military thinking could not comprehend: that free societies, when fully mobilized, possess productive capacities that authoritarian regimes cannot match or counter. The final irony lay not in the Sherman's combat record, impressive though it was, but in what it represented beyond the battlefield. Each tank that rolled through liberated European towns carried within its mechanical systems the DNA of American industrial democracy, the organizational principles that would rebuild Europe, establish international institutions, and create the economic prosperity that would define the post-war world. The same assembly line techniques that produced Shermans would produce the automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods that would transform global society in the decades following victory. Years later, former German tank commanders would reflect on this period with a mixture of professional respect and philosophical bewilderment. They had been trained to think of warfare as a test of individual excellence, technological superiority, and cultural tradition. Instead, they had encountered something unprecedented in military history: warfare as the expression of democratic abundance, industrial efficiency, and collective determination. The Sherman tank had not defeated them through superior firepower or protection, but through something far more profound and ultimately more decisive: the mechanical manifestation of a society that could produce both military victory and civilian prosperity simultaneously. In the end, the sound of Sherman tracks on European cobblestones had announced not just military conquest, but the dawn of the American century, an era in which democratic values, industrial abundance, and technological innovation would combine to reshape the entire global order. The German soldiers who had once laughed at American tanks had witnessed, without fully understanding it, the birth of the modern world.